Hello everyone and welcome back to Black Blaze Gaming. I'm Dakota, and today we have an interesting topic that will forever permeate through all MMOs and is certainly no stranger to Elder Scrolls Online. Queuing up for group content with random strangers. I remember early in my time playing ESO that I used to be more frustrated about this, usually because I was echoing the sentiments of the more casual players that I associated with at that time. Of course, the concept I'm referring to is the tendency of veteran players who are tired of running the same dungeons over and over, basically running ahead, skipping ads, or just generally leaving the group behind. I also used to get super frustrated with fake tanks or fake healers. I was inspired to make this video based on Nesagaya's video, or by extension, NephesQS's reaction to that video. Now, despite my introduction here, I actually have some counter arguments to the points made in those videos, but before I get to that, let me clarify my overall perspective on some of the common complaints of public dungeon queues. First of all, fake tanking. This is an age-old complaint that I'm kind of surprised to see hasn't really been resolved overall in the community because it's a very simple concept. When you queue for a random dungeon in the role of a tank, I would argue that it is courteous to at least slot a taunt for some of the tougher enemies or bosses, though oftentimes it's not really necessary on normal difficulty. In veteran base game dungeons, I would say fake tanking is fine, and slotting a taunt is generally just best practice when running with strangers. But fake tanking should just generally not be done in random queues for veteran DLC dungeons. Of course, I'm not saying fake tanking isn't possible in veteran DLC dungeons, but it's a mixed bag for running with randos, and it's just best to at least be able to fulfill the basic principles of the tank role, such as not dying, holding aggro, and not running the boss all over Hell's Half Acres. I like things to stay in my ground-based AoEs. And this is where Nephes's main point comes into play. He says that when queuing for dungeons with total strangers, you should not go in with any expectations at all. This is basically true. There is no reason to expect other players to play a certain way or to be built for the role they queued up as. I will, however, offer one caveat to this. I think that it is reasonable to want, not necessarily expect, but at least to want other players to be mindful of the group aspect of the game. I understand that there is no option to do random daily dungeons solo, which is a shame, but also understandable, as the devs don't want to discourage people from keeping the queuing system lively and healthy. But here is where we get into sort of the meat of this situation. If you are a veteran player, functionally capable of soloing many dungeons on normal, you are queuing for randoms, you can make the reasonable assumption that you will likely get new or inexperienced players, and as a representative of the community with lots of experience, you should at least try to make newer or less experienced players feel somewhat more comfortable and welcome. I'm not saying you've got to spend 200 hours walking someone through the complicated mechanics of Scale, Color, Peak, but simply maintaining a reasonable pace and paying attention to the needs of the group can go a long way in improving the steadily deteriorating community atmosphere. What I mean by this is that you should be aware that in certain base game dungeons, quests can be long drawn-out affairs, and many new players will want to complete them still to get extra skill points. Of course, long dialogue scenes and grindy-ass group dungeons are bad design by nature, and ZOS generally stopped doing them in later DLC dungeons, although there's been a couple of exceptions that really bother me. You should try to encourage the group to keep moving, but not just speed off into the distance if the group is trying to loot or complete objectives. I understand wanting to get things done as quickly as possible, but just ignoring your group's wants so you can speed ahead is simply selfish, and you should expect that someone's going to dislike that behavior. This concept is also true for casual or new players, though, and is a good rule of thumb for any multiplayer game or group activity in general. It does work in reverse. If you see that the group is moving quickly, try to adjust your playstyle to meet theirs wherever possible. And maintain communication. Let them know that you need to get something done so that they have a reason to understand that you might not be catching up to the group. This is no different than a game like Apex Legends, for example. If you're a high-speed, aggressive player, but you queue in with two defense legends who want to bunker down and outlast the enemy, your best chances of winning lie in adjusting how you utilize your playstyle to support that of your teammates. Oftentimes, when queuing solo, you may be paired with people who know each other and queued together, so your method of play may just be outvoted. None of this is to suggest that you should sacrifice your entire playstyle to accommodate people who stand around digging through their inventories in dungeons. I mean, if you do that, you're not being mindful of the group and deserve to be left behind. It is selfish behavior as well. One major argument people make is that if you want to take your time in dungeons, you should just queue up with friends so you can take things at your own pace. That's a pretty fair point. However, new players tend to have a much smaller amount of people available to run with, and of course, that logic can also be reversed. If you want to speed through dungeons ignoring mechs and rolls, why aren't you queuing with friends? As a veteran player, you'll typically have a lot more people to run with, especially at a similar skill level to your own. But you also have to consider that coordinating a group to queue up for 20 characters a day can be a nightmare and just as time consuming as queuing up with really slow pugs. And that's assuming that you have people available at the same time as you and for those 20 runs in a row where you're having to regroup after logging out every time because grouping isn't account wide for some reason, unlike other MMOs already having that be a feature. In the end, I think it's just interesting how there's still so much back and forth on these topics considering how simple it all is. You have people like Nessa Gaia, who admittedly isn't as egregious as some, predominantly people who are PvP mains when it comes to random dungeons. And then you have Nephis QS, who just says simply, no expectations, be selfish, stop complaining. And then you have people at the opposite extreme, just run it my way or no way at all, and no, I will not tell you what my way is, so just guess, lol. Who are ironically just as exclusionary and gatekeepy as the elitist endgame sweats they tend to complain about. Either side, you're trying to force people into playing the way you want them to, and both sides are being selfish. It's toxic casuals versus toxic veterans. This is a problem that will never really go away, but it does make for interesting discussion, despite, again, being a pretty simple concept. To sum it up all one more time, it's just generally courteous to make adjustments to your playstyle in order to support your group in a group setting. But when queuing solo, you cannot reasonably expect people to do that. Furthermore, just because it cannot be reasonably expected of others does not mean it's not rude or selfish to just prioritize your own needs at all times above all others. It still is selfish and rude and flies in the face of what many consider to be one of the most polite and welcoming MMO communities around. Now, before I leave, I'd like to offer a few anecdotes as tips from how I approach dungeon content in general. In random normals where I queue up solo, I tend to alter my builds in preparation for the likely scenario where I will be queued up with improperly built characters. A good example is if I queue as a Dragon Knight, I'll swap out one of my skills to slot Molten Weapons to provide the group with major brutality and sorcery, as oftentimes people don't want to waste expensive power potions on normal dungeons, or in some cases, they have no access to those buffs due to not knowing how to build properly. As a tank, I'll typically run more damage-focused skills and may not run Aggressive Warhorn. Now, that may sound strange, but let me explain. Aggressive Warhorn's crit damage bonus is amazing in PvE, but if players in your group aren't built for crit chance, as many experienced players often aren't, there isn't nearly as much benefit to that buff as something like Major Berserk or Major Vulnerability, which improves all damage. So my builds get adjusted for a more general purpose damage increase for my allies, as well as providing some of my own damage if possible, like slotting Storm Atronach on my Sorcerer tank rather than Warhorn. At the opposite end of the spectrum, I also run a core team for 4-man content where I don't force players to run specific setups or sacrifice their entire playstyle just to meet my needs as a player, or as a lead and mechanics teacher. Instead, the people in my group are simply expected to be willing to learn and to play off of one another. If I'm not going to force them to adjust their playstyle to fit mine, they also cannot expect that everyone else warp their play around them either, so there has to be some level of give and take. A few years ago, when I was progging Fanglair hard mode, one tank we have was struggling with certain mechanics. One of them was taking aggro on the Bone Colossus that each crystal spawns. He was really struggling to quickly gain that line of sight to taunt as well as manage Thurvakun's mechanics at the same time. To accommodate this, I slotted a taunt on my DPS and just roll dodged heavy attacks while I burned the crystal and then focused the Colossus. This also had the added benefit that We already had the Bone Colossus separate from the boss and could do a full burn without risking over damaging the boss and pushing to the next threshold before we were ready. But it wasn't only myself who made an adjustment to support the team, as the tank also had to change his approach to one of Thurvakun's mechanics, as he was struggling to consistently survive it. This is Thurvo's heavy attack that spawns 2 beetles. For one reason or another, our tank just kept missing the block on that heavy. Of course, blocking has always been sluggish and a bit buggy, but it didn't help that he was running at a sub 30 FPS around that time due to his aging PC and much less optimization of the game at the time. As an experiment, he tried swapping to a roll dodge instead of attempting to block, and the difference it made was immediately apparent. Our first attempt after he made this change got us to execute really easily with no deaths, and it's something that we have struggled to get to at all previously. It's all about give and take in group play. So my general advice on this is follows, and yes, I'm kind of repeating myself, but if you're playing a multiplayer game with complete strangers, you cannot reasonably expect that they will be courteous, let alone willing to cater to your playstyle. There are no repercussions or stakes at hand, and it's the internet. That said, just because it wouldn't be reasonable to expect courteousness, you are not absolved from being discourteous. Any player is essentially a representative of this game's community, even if it is unfair to make a generalization based on a singular experience. Just because you cannot be forced to comply with group tactics and playstyles does not mean that being selfish is entirely justifiable. And like I said, some players who sit in their inventories for extended periods in dungeons are just as selfish. And no sensible person would blame you for just going on and doing the dungeon without them. It's very simple and easy to just pay attention to your group and what they're doing and try to support them while you all work towards your common goal. And if they refuse to show you that same courtesy, fuck them. Do whatever you want. Just don't pretend like every complaint you get comes out of nowhere and is entirely baseless or unreasonable. So that's about it for me. Feel free to let me know your thoughts on the matter in the comments. I have no doubt there's something I missed as I wrote up this script in a single sitting, but I will say that this is one of the few areas of my perspective where I genuinely doubt anyone will ever change my mind. This is how I feel, and given the simplicity of this topic, it's really unlikely that some new information I hadn't previously considered might surface and change my view. But I'm open to being proven wrong. Thank you so much for watching, and please consider subscribing. I'd love to have you. And I'll see you next time.
Woo.